Anyone who wants to be first among you must be slave to all. Would you be willing to be a slave? Here we have Jesus is saying pretty strongly, anyone who wants to be first among you must be slave to all. What does this really mean to be a slave? What was this context that Jesus was speaking in? Most Australians have probably never met a slave. Most of us have probably not had a lot to do with slavery. But we do know that slavery is still present throughout the world. And we should be concerned for slavery happening throughout the world. In the ancient Roman times, there were many slaves. The Romans kept all sorts of slaves, and slaves were considered property. They didn't have the right to choose what they did on a daily basis. They didn't have freedom. Over the last few weeks, we've been talking about, within our community, freedom. And over the next few weeks, more and more freedoms will be opened up to us. But here we have Jesus is saying, we need to be slaves. So what was that experience like in ancient times when Jesus was speaking about it? And what is Jesus asking us to do by becoming slaves to all? First of all, slaves were considered property. So who owns us? Whose property are we? Are we the property of Australia? Maybe because we hold a passport, does that make us the property of Australia? Maybe. Are we the property of our own families? Well, maybe. Someone might say that we are all individuals, we've got our own power to do what we want, and so we're nobody's property. But in another sense, we are all created. We are creatures of God. And you could say that we are the property of God. And I think that's sort of what Jesus is getting at here. If we are the property of God, what does this mean? If someone's another person's property, someone gets to choose what that person does. And we need to seek out what the will of the master is. And so by becoming slaves, it's not that we lose our freedom, but we understand that the one who owns us, the one who gives us the best guidance in our life, is not ourselves, is not our community, it's not even our nation. But first and foremost, we seek the will of God. And that's what we pray when we pray the Our Father. Thy will be done. We're recognizing the fact that we are in a relationship with God, and that first and foremost, we seek not our will or the will of others, we're seeking the will of God. And that's what slaves often had to do. They would wake up and they'd think, what do I do today? I need to seek the will of the master to live out what I needed to do. And this happened at the time of Jesus. Jesus probably knew slaves and helped them to understand that when they're living life, they're not just living life for their master in this world, they're living life for the eternal master. In ancient Roman times, there were some masters who owned slaves who were nice. They looked after their slaves well, perhaps in the way that we look after the property that we might have today. We might look after our car, we might look after our house. But then there were other masters at that time who treated slaves badly, who were cruel to them, who were mean. And sometimes we might do that as well through sin. But when we seek the will of God, we're not seeking a cruel God, a God to be afraid of. We seek a God who's about love, who's about justice. And when we are the slaves of God, this is what this gospel's talking about, that means we seek the will of God in all things. Our priority is not just what we want, what I want, but it's God's will to bring the love of God to others, to live it out in our family, our community, in our world. Part of being a slave requires humility, to know that it's not all about ourselves. And that's another great virtue as well. to say, I'm not in control entirely. I'm okay, and that's okay. I'm okay to be worshipping God, loving God, seeking the will of God in all things. And so we seek humility. Throughout our world today, there is slavery still happening. Sometimes, in different parts of the world, people are forced into slavery. As Christians, this gospel is asking us to choose to do the will of God, to be in this relationship where we know that we are God's property, that we are there to live, to bring God to the world. But that shouldn't be imposed upon anybody against their will. People should be given freedom. People should be given the dignity to be who they are. And so where there is slavery happening in our world today, when children or others are forced into labour against their will, we should do what we can to stop that occurring in lots of different ways. Our government has policies, our church has policies to try to assist people who are in difficult situations, who have been forced into slavery. We also know that there is many products that we buy that come from all sorts of different places. Sometimes we don't even know where they've come from. And sometimes they've come to us and we can purchase them at certain shops here even in our own area, and they might have come to us from people who have been in forced labour and even from little children producing items for us. And that's not right. This is not the slavery Jesus talks about. Jesus says, anyone who wants to be first among you must be the slave to all. This is what Jesus is saying about a relationship with God, and then a relationship of humility and a commitment to service. That's what we're about. When that's imposed upon someone in a negative way, we should do everything we can to give freedom. So today, as we reflect on this gospel, reflecting on slavery, let's reflect that we are not just independent of everybody, independent of God, that we are God's property, and that God expects us to do good things, to live out his love in the world. Let us be people of humility. Let us do what we can in our world today to eliminate slavery that's been forced upon people, and give people the choice to say, yes, we want to be God's property. We want to be about the love of God. We want to seek God's will and bring that love of God to all in our world today. If anyone wants to be first among you, let him be the slave to all.